An understanding of the life cycle of hemlock woolly adelgid can really help us to see why it's so invasive here in New England. First of all, hemlock woolly adelgid has 2 generations each year. A lot of insects, of course, only have 1. And it's just, to me, so interesting that the hemlock woolly adelgid is so in sync with its food source, which of course is exclusively the hemlock tree. But the hemlock tree manufactures the majority of its photosynthate, its starch, in the wintertime. Of course, most plants aren't very active in the wintertime, but it's so shade tolerant that you often find the hemlock trees under the cover of hardwood trees. Of course, the hardwood leaves catch all the sun in the summer, but in the winter those leaves are gone, and so the hemlock trees are able to make their food. And it's incredible to me that's when adelgid are also really, really active. And it turns out that the winter generation of adelgid actually bears more eggs than the spring generation, which just, again, kind of emphasizes how important that is. Another really cool thing about adelgid, and it speaks also to why it's so invasive, is that the adelgid, they're all females, and they don't have any wings. So their reproduction is parthenogenic, asexual reproduction. They don't have to spend any time or energy looking for a mate. All their energy goes into just making more adelgid. And again, that kind of explains why they're so invasive. And being active in the winter, many of the generalist predators are not active. So they avoid that component of population dynamics that would usually keep their populations low. The idea that they're wingless is interesting. They're dispersed primarily by birds and wind. But for a brief time, they do use their legs just after they're hatched. The crawler stage, the first nymphal stage, will use their legs to find a new feeding spot. And then they use their legs to attach or settle to a twig. And it's interesting that once they settle, that's where an adelgid will live and die. They'll go through the molting process, but they don't move, they don't leave that site. So they're hatched, they migrate out to a new feeding site, they settle down, they begin to feed, and as they feed, they grow and develop a new woolly covering, the ovisac. And that will protect them as they develop, and when they're mature and lay eggs, the ovisac keeps the eggs from drying out. So it's an interesting life cycle, it's an interesting insect, and many of its characteristics go to making it very invasive.
They're related to aphids. They have the same kind of a sucking mouthpiece. It's actually 4 or 5 times longer than their body length. And so they kind of, you know, it's like shoving a big long straw down into the twig. They feed out of the woody portion, not out of the needles. Mm-hmm. And what they actually take out of the needles, the twigs, is starch. And that's the energy reserve for the tree. Right. So that the tree begins to run out of energy, it doesn't put on new growth. And then also the stylet, or that's the name of the mouthpiece, as they put it in, their saliva reacts with the tree and creates sort of, we'd call it scar tissue. Mm-hmm. But that jams up the vascular system so that the food and water aren't flowing back and forth, and eventually the twigs die. And so the symptoms that we would notice would be a discoloration of those needles, thinning of the crown, and then eventually they die back.